Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. My name is Zachary Goldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Law and Security here at NYU, and we're thrilled that you were able to join us. So I think at this point, everybody is quite aware of the threat posed by ISIS. The group has been at the forefront of the public discussion, not least because the administration a couple of weeks ago put forth a new draft authorization for the use of military force. Now, this despite the fact that we've been bombing ISIS for a couple of months. I think that's sort of a bit of sophistry that only lawyers could cook up. But while the group's brutality is quite clear, its strategy and the way in which its strategy implicates American interests, I think, is a lot less clear. And so the purpose of the discussion this evening is to really understand both the group itself better and, almost as important, the regional context, or maybe even more important, the regional context from which it emerged. And this regional context is, to say the least, unsettled. Civil war in Syria and Iraq, deeply unsettled political terrain in Egypt, the rest of North Africa, Yemen, and on throughout the region. And in the context of all of this, we appear to be at or near finalizing a deal with Iran over its nuclear program. So no shortage of extremely difficult issues to think about and work through, and really no smarter and better informed group of people than the folks sitting here to my left. So I think we'll speak together for about 45 minutes this evening, open it up to the rest of you for questions, and then try and wrap up around 7:30. So let me just very briefly introduce everyone here. Starting at the far end is a colleague and friend, Liz Rosenberg, Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security in Washington, where she runs the Energy, Economics and Security Program. For several years, Liz and I were very fortunate to be colleagues at the Treasury Department, where she worked in very senior roles on sanctions and illicit finance issues. Liz also has very, very deep expertise in the energy and oil markets, so it's a pleasure to have her here this evening. Just to Liz's right, geographically, not politically, is Suzanne Maloney. Suzanne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Most recently in government, she was with the State Department's policy planning staff, and she focuses mostly on Iran. Next to her is Steve Simon, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Steve was a senior director on the National Security Council with responsibility for the Middle East and North Africa in the Obama administration, and has very, very long experience thinking about and working on these issues. And to my left is Admiral William Fallon. Admiral Fallon is currently the chairman of the board of Counterattack, a cybersecurity endpoint and threat detection company. But before that was the combatant commander for U.S. Pacificom Command and U.S. Central Command, which is the military command in charge of the Middle East and North Africa, and I believe the first naval officer to hold that position. So it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. So Admiral Fallon, I think I'll start the conversation with a few questions directed towards you. The President has said that the goal of the United States has been to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. But in the draft legislation he sent to Congress last week, there was a limitation in there that said there will be no enduring commitment of ground forces or something like that. So talk a little bit about the military campaign that's been underway now for a couple of months, what it can reasonably hope to achieve, and how we should think about what a military force can accomplish in a situation like this.
Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you back at NYU again. What a view. Stunning. I wish the view were similarly nice in this region in the Middle East where the turmoil is taking place, but it's not, and it's not likely to improve significantly anytime soon. The challenge of ISIS is that it's been operating in an ungoverned environment in both Syria and Iraq and in other places, Libya. They're trying to get a foothold there, and exactly what ISIS is, or Daesh, or the Islamic State, or any of the other dozen or so handles that they've picked up or people have ascribed to them is certainly a matter for discussion. But what isn't debatable is the activity that they've been conducting and the danger this poses to individuals and to other government entities in the region. So the state of affairs right now, in my view, is that they've been running amok in mostly northern Syria, taking advantage of the civil war that's been ongoing for a number of years. And because their roots for many of the leaders are actually in Iraq, and to that end, al-Baghdadi, the leader of the gang, was actually in prison when I was the commander over there at Camp Bucca in southern Iraq for the time that I was the commander. He was released after I left and went on about his ways. So this group made a very, very strong entry into Iraq last summer. And this isn't something that just happened overnight. They had been infiltrating into the Sunni heartland in Anbar and the northern provinces, and they obviously had some local support. And the situation with the Iraqi military was pretty discouraging, certainly to someone like myself who spent an awful lot of time trying to get them up to speed. And our country spent quite a bit of money and time and effort and blood to make them better. The fact is the Army was pretty well gutted, I think, primarily by the former leader of Iraq, Maliki, who didn't like any of the Sunni leadership and was distrustful of the Kurds as well. So he put a bunch of cronies in there. And when push came to shove, they had no stomach whatsoever for any fight. So we all saw what happened. So now what do? We have gone back in, the U.S. has gone back in, really to take a position that I advocated very strongly for back in 2007, 2008, that we leave some number of our people there, not as combat forces at all, but to do exactly what they're doing now, advising the Iraqi military on how to do things and to give them those capabilities that they don't have themselves. So we have a number of troops. I don't know exactly what the number is, probably 2,000 or 3,000. Most of them are in advisory roles. There are some special forces that are over there operating. And of course, we have the air campaign, which has been essential to stopping ISIS from moving forward in Iraq. But the air effort, as essential as it is for doing that and for helping the potential of a ground advance to retake these territories, the air business isn't going to solve the problem. It just isn't going to happen. And however, it's essential for keeping ISIS in place for now. So the desire the president outlined to defeat this gang is pretty noble. I don't think we're going to be able to get rid of them altogether, but I think they can be contained and pushed back. But a prerequisite for all of this is not the strength or numbers of any U.S. military or any allies or colleagues that we may enlist in this effort. The real key is in the political side, and particularly in Iraq, which I think is going to be the place where any activity is going to take place in the near term. And the reality is that unless the new government there convinces the Sunnis that they are going to support them and give them a fair shake in the outcome of governance in Iraq, then we're just not going to get there. People have to feel that they've got a piece of the future in this country. To me, it seems so obvious. There's certainly tons of wealth. Money's not an issue. They've got more oil and gas than they can even count. But the prerequisite for success over here is that people have to feel that the Iraqi government is going to support all comers, Kurds, Sunni, as well as the Shia. Syria is a different matter. Syria is much more complex, and I think there's no doubt in my mind that the thinking in Washington is, let's try to do something in Iraq, and we'll worry about Syria later. Not to ignore it, because Daesh has centers of gravity in Syria. They're obviously moving troops and equipment back and forth, and that's going to have to be curtailed. That can be done pretty effectively from the air, given the environmentals over there. It's wide open territory. It's largely desert. It's very difficult to move unseen in vehicles. Small numbers of people, of course, can go almost anywhere, but any large force that would try to reinforce into Iraq or to support an effort once the Iraqis get moving, I guess there's some effort underway right now to push back into Crete. Air power can be very decisive, but again, of its own, it's not going to win. So the objective of trying to diminish their capability, push them out of most of the places in Iraq, I think is quite doable if the Sunni people in Anbar in particular believe that the government's going to support them. So that's kind of where we are. And one other thing, I guess, back to the point about U.S. troops and the kind of the fine print here. There's no desire whatsoever that I've been able to discern in any of the leadership in Washington right now to go back into Iraq with any combat forces of the size and shape and capabilities that we had back in the last decade. Just not going to happen. However, I've been and would continue to advocate for selective special forces applications that can help the Iraqis with capabilities they don't have. Our people are very, very professional, and we actually have people operating in many countries throughout the region, and I think that would be a pretty good adjunct to what's going to have to be the essential movement of Iraq forces to try to retake this territory. So we're not going to see big numbers of U.S. troops under any circumstances.
Thank you. So, Suzanne, I wanted to pick up on a couple of points that Admiral Fallon made, particularly about the need for an inclusive Iraqi government. And one of the things that many people talk about as having alienated the Sunni population was Prime Minister Maliki's sort of sectarian approach and the fact that he was very strongly supported by the Iranian government. So I'm hoping that you could maybe talk a little bit about the Iranian view of Iraq and the ISIS problem, how Iran sort of thinks about its interests in Iraq. There have been, it's sort of widely known that Iran is fighting in Iraq. Also, I think the word or the term that's been used is coordinated deconfliction between the U.S. and Iran operating in Iraq. But just talk a little bit about sort of how Iran sees the region, the threat from ISIS, and the future of its relationship with Iraq.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks so much to NYU for allowing me to be part of this great panel. It's interesting, I think, to watch the debate in Washington on Iran's role in Iraq and Iran's role in the fight against ISIS, particularly with a view to history. Because it's tempting now for so many to look at Haidar al-Abadi and say, okay, he's a kind of stand-up guy, he seems to be doing all the right things in his early months in office. But if you flash back a few years, there was a similar view of Maliki. We're often looking for the right individual in the right place at the right time. And when that person doesn't tend to work out, we tend to revert to the hope that we can find someone better. And that has been our persistent pattern, I think, with respect to our policy in Iraq. Whether you think it's a personnel issue or whether you think it's a structural issue, it really does influence the way that you approach the problem in Iraq. And my tendency would be to believe that the difficulties that we face in Iraq are as much structural and institutional as they are about the personalities of the individual leaders involved. From that perspective, one of the big structural issues, of course, is Iran. Iran has an existential interest in maintaining some sort of influence within Iraq. The invasion, the 1980 invasion by Saddam Hussein, is still very much the formative experience for the Iranian leadership. They see the world through that prism, a prism in which the attack was wholly unanticipated. It occurred at a time when the Iranian army had been decimated by revolutionary purges and general turmoil within the country. And it was perceived very much, and events and rhetoric and the course of the war played into this, is not just a war of one country against another, but very much a world war fought via Saddam Hussein against the Islamic Republic and the revolutionary regime. And so that perception, the perception that the world was against them, that Iraq was a tool, that in fact there is a conglomeration of Sunni interest in trying to avoid Iran's empowerment and to prevent Iran from having a secure future in the region, that is once again manifesting itself through ISIS at this time, an ISIS that the Iranians see as very much supported by and in fact a creation of the Gulf states and even U.S. allies within the Gulf. So this is why I think we're going to continue to see an incredible investment on the part of the Iranians in the future of Iraq, a willingness to put boots on the ground, to put their best troops in the form of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian Quds Force, who is very much perceived as, now an international media star. If you're on Twitter, you see at least one selfie a day of Qasem Soleimani in various parts of Iraq, involved directly in the anti-ISIS campaign. That, I think, is a signal that the Iranians are prepared to identify themselves with this in a very direct and meaningful fashion, and they believe themselves to be the most effective fighting force. It is not, of course, a fighting force that's going to be conducive to the long-term stability of Iraq. Iran's allies and clients in Iraq are the very forces that contributed to the rending of the social fabric under al-Maliki. And I think there's really, no expectation that however honest and well-intended Haider al-Abadi might be, and however improved his governance may be, that we're not going to see the same sort of issues emerge time and time again within Iraq. Iraq is very much now the battlefield for the sectarian divide that exists within the region, a competition that is one of both regional power, but also obviously dueling narratives of religious interpretation. And how the nuclear issue plays into that is going to contribute very much, I think, to how the rest of the region contends with what they see as an Iran on the march and very much claiming Iraq as its own territory. Just a word on this issue of coordinated deconfliction. I think, early on there were a lot of hopes and expectations that there might be a real opportunity here for some kind of cooperation between the U.S. and Iranian militaries. It was an argument put forward by advocates of engagement within Washington, the same people who are very much in favor of the nuclear deal. It was also put forward, I think, in a very utilitarian fashion by some of the Iranian officials, in particular Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani when he came here to New York for the UN General Assembly last fall. I think that there's almost no prospect of real, meaningful military-to-military coordination in this fight. Ultimately, we have very different interests, very different objectives, and we are dealing with groups on the part of these Iranian proxies that have been directly involved with the murder of American servicemen in Iraq. And so I think that there are both logistical, ideological, and fundamentally interest-based reasons why we can't coordinate. This can't be room for a kind of new grand alliance in the region. Add to that the fact that if you look at what the Iranian security establishment is saying, all the way up to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, there's really no appetite on the Iranian side for a kind of grand partnership, either explicit or tacit, with the United States in the fight against ISIS. So while we may be moving on parallel tracks, and while I think that there's going to be avenues of communication that exist, there surely are already, and they will probably expand over time to ensure that we are not sort of, getting at wrong foot with one another. I think that this is not an opportunity to be built upon, and in fact, almost irrespective of what happens with the nuclear negotiations, we are likely to face more frictions and conflict with Iran within Iraq, over Syria, and over other regional issues.
Great. So maybe actually I'll turn to Liz. Liz, you're just back from the region, and you've very intently focused on the nuclear issue. It's sort of the second half of the way in which Iran's political interests are playing into this discussion. So maybe just talk a little bit about where things stand on the nuclear discussion, what the kind of sentiment is in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and then kind of also the sort of second half of the way Iran sees its interest is through the sort of economic lens. So maybe just talk a little bit also about how the accumulated effects of sanctions and lower oil prices are sort of shaping the way Iran looks at the next couple of months of its relationship between itself and its regional allies in the United States.
Sure, I'll take that all on.
Yeah, just very quickly.
Okay, right. So a brief background on the nuclear negotiations. So the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany and Iran are almost a year, they're deep into negotiations. Oh, okay, thank you. Summarizing the P5+1 negotiations. So the P5+1 in Iran remain intently focused on their negotiations. Reports suggest that that the parties have made progress together, but big divisions still exist. However, the desire to potentially to achieve successful nuclear diplomacy is so great that the parties remain in the room and negotiating together, and there have been, I think, more hopeful noises coming out of the negotiations in the relatively recent past, perhaps the last month or so, although nothing is certain, and of course President Obama and others have put the likelihood of a nuclear deal at less than 50%, so let's manage everyone's expectations here on prospects for that. As far as the timeline for this, the P5+1 in Iran have extended their negotiations through the end of June, except that the president, President Obama, this administration had sort of boxed himself into a corner of the end of March. So, and he has said we will try and achieve success, a framework deal, a deal in principle by the end of March, after which we can work on specifics of a deal through the end of the period that they have extended into the summer. And in fact, Congress, which has made much of their unhappiness with this process, both a concern about not being consulted and brought in and properly notified about the nature of the negotiations and what issues are still of contention and outstanding. Congress has said and has given a clear indication that they will pass legislation to threaten new sanctions on Iran if it does not come forward and agree to, if the P5+1 doesn't agree and Iran don't agree to a framework deal by the end of March. And the view as articulated by Iran and by other members of the P5+1, the Europeans in particular, is that doing so and passing new legislations by this Congress will sabotage the nuclear diplomacy, and that'll be it. The parties will walk away, and that's the end. So right now, actually, given all that's going on in Washington with Netanyahu's visit presently and the AIPAC conference, and there's quite a lot of focus on this particular set. There's two pieces of legislation that Congress is contemplating, one to impose more sanctions, and the second one, it's an up or down vote on a potential agreement, a nuclear agreement, which is basically a cynical attempt to sabotage an agreement that comes forward. They are making waves in news, and certainly the message is clear to Iran and the other negotiating partners that Congress has very strong feelings about prospects for nuclear diplomacy and isn't feeling too positively about it. Okay, so Iran's economic interest. Oh, statements from the Gulf, excuse me. So I was in the Gulf last week, and the concerns that I heard a lot of, both solicited and unsolicited in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE in particular, were deep anxiety about the prospects of a successful deal. And basically, they're concerned that the United States, the P5+1, would create a positive relationship, diplomatic and economic, with Iran, welcome Iran back into the international community, remove the economic effects, remove sanctions and the economic effects of sanctions, and make peace basically with this long-term security, competitor for influence in the region, and the United States is the primary security guarantor for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf allies, would be siding with an enemy, if you will. So some of this is hyperbole and an expression of a lot of anxiety, but I take it very seriously that they're deeply concerned. They think the U.S. is naive in its foreign policy. It is wrong to disassociate the nuclear file on Iran from other security files or interests having to do with Iran, such as its support for terrorism and efforts to destabilize the region. They believe that if sanctions pressure is removed, then the United States and its allies in the P5+1 will have given up all of this leverage, and these Gulf countries will be left in the middle, literally surrounded by chaos in the region and abandoned by their security guarantor. So it was pretty bleak, right? I think for Iran's part, what they're primarily hoping for in the relief that they would receive from sanctions. That's an ability to move back into the international community to sell its oil at least the amounts that it was selling at before the most aggressive punishing sanctions were put in place in 2012, so moving back up to about 2.5 barrels of exports or more relatively quickly, being able to transact more easily in the international financial system, getting access to over $100 billion in its foreign exchange reserves that are currently held in escrow. And this would mean more, not just competition for regional influence and the projection of regional influence with some of those Gulf countries I was just mentioning, but also, of course, very serious economic competition with them. The kind of oil that they sell competes directly with the oil that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries sell in the kind of crude and the markets, the consumer markets in Asia. They actively try and undercut one another in order to price that crude, and we'd see a lot more of that. So maybe I'll stop there unless you want me to take on anything else at this moment.
Well, no. Another PhD dissertation will come after.
Right.
I think Liz and Suzanne, I think a lot of what you touched on are the way the United States is perceived both as a power broker and its own interest in the region. And Steve, so I thought I might turn to you and ask about the extent to which you see ISIS really as a threat to American interests, not only in the Syria, Iraq area, but sort of more broadly where ISIS is starting to, you could choose an appropriate verb, associate itself with groups or sprout associated groups in Libya and Sinai and elsewhere. So they have very effectively sort of played on American heartstrings by absolutely brutally murdering American journalists and British journalists and aid workers. But how do you talk a little bit about how you see the threat from ISIS, maybe how you compare it to kind of al-Qaeda core from the late 90s to early 2000s, and how we in the U.S. should really think about our interests with respect to a group like ISIS?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Excellent.
Okay. Look, I wouldn't buy any stock in ISIS. If you've got $5 burning a hole in your pocket, get yourself a Frappuccino. Don't spend it on shares in ISIS. I think their longevity is not going to be all that great for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, they're kind of a strange mix of things. Iraqi Baathists, thugs and fantasists, religious maniacs, professional rebels, very experienced hardcore insurgents. I mean, it's not just one thing. It's sort of a congeries of things. And this just suggests that if proper pressure is applied at certain points, In certain ways, the group can be split up. I mean, bits can be hived off, maybe make it a little less dangerous. The other thing about ISIS is that it has a bit of an apocalyptic tinge to it, maybe more than an apocalyptic tinge. There was a little bit of this to al-Qaeda in its early days as well. The ISIS ideologues and clerics tend to express themselves in the language of apocalypticism. And this is one reason why some of their violence has been so extravagant, and in part also why their approach to combat operations maybe has been so successful. I mean, for the ideologues in this group, the Middle East looks right now a lot like the hadiths, the stories about early Muslims predicted the pre-apocalyptic age would resemble. Big wars of sectarian strife, Iraq falling apart, invasions from the West. These are signs of the apocalypse, and they're taken quite seriously. Now, they're also trying to form a caliphate. Now, there are various views on the formation of caliphates in the Muslim, readings of Islam. There is an apocalyptic tradition where the caliphate is established before the end of days, before the end of time. And I think this is certainly how al-Baghdadi conceived of the establishment of the caliphate when he first declared it. But, they've also got an interest in governance. And there's a little bit of a tension, as you can imagine, between, on the one hand, saying, well, the world is actually going to end tomorrow, and on the other hand, saying, we must bring in all pharmacists for lessons on how to practice pharmacy in order to be licensed. It's like, look, if the world's going to end, why are you worrying about that? Well, maybe the world won't end. These changes overtake apocalyptic movements, but the apocalyptic, as opposed to eschatological nature of this group, really does inject it with a degree of fervor and energy that, as we've seen, is pretty astonishing. I mean, that they do really mean things to people is in part a function of civil wars generally. Civil wars are pretty bad, and you get excesses of really sort of grandiose, if I can put it that way, expressive violence that can be disgusting in the ways that their actions have been, that ISIS actions have been. But the other thing about ISIS, and this is all sort of part of a picture I'm trying to paint of a group that's it's a function of so many different impulses and influences and shared experiences. They come out of a very violent cauldron, as Admiral Fallon was explaining a couple of minutes ago. They have been immersed in intensive violence for a long time, certainly since the U.S. entered Iraq in 2003. And what political scientists will tell you is that, what happens when you have societies or parts of societies that are immersed in this kind of violence for prolonged periods of time, they really internalize it in a way as a way of life and a way to practice politics. You just get used to it, and so you practice it. So there's all these excesses. Now the thing about ISIS as a short-lived group, at least in this context, is that it's got fairly powerful enemies. It's not nothing in this case, as my colleagues to my left have described, to have Iran on your case. For the Iranians, this is a big deal. They've allocated serious resources to dealing with it. And in combination with what the United States is doing, as Admiral Fallon described, this isn't so great. Now, on top of what the Iranians are doing, you have a militia, a Shiite militia structure in Iraq that is pretty ugly itself. And these are people you do not want on your case. They have their analogs, they have their counterparts in Syria, where the National Defense Force, which consists largely of these Shabiha units, these paramilitaries, maybe 100,000 of them, they're quite tough, and they don't like Sunnis. They seriously dislike them. So, you've got enemies arrayed against this group that are determined to see it contained, if not completely destroyed. Then, of course, you have the historical boundaries of the Middle East and nation states that a group like ISIS will find it very hard to penetrate. I mean, by implication from what we were just saying, they can't invade Iran. It's highly unlikely they're going to invade Saudi Arabia and take it over. It's extremely unlikely that they're going to invade Turkey and take it over, although there is a subtle process of Pakistanization taking place in Turkey that could hollow it out from within in this way. They're not going to invade Israel. The Israelis are pretty capable of taking care of themselves. And in Lebanon, well, they can go in there. They've got a portal, actually. But ultimately, they have to face Hezbollah, and on the other side of Hezbollah, they have to face the Israelis. So not a whole lot of room for maneuver. Of course, there is Jordan, and they could probably do a raid into Jordan and make a mess in a few northern towns before getting expelled, to the great embarrassment of King Abdullah. But I don't think that they will bring the Jordanian state to its knees. The U.S. has invested tremendously in Jordan over the past 3 years. U.S. aid to Jordan has tripled. Just last December, there were 6,000 U.S. troops as part of an exercise that were deployed to Jordan as a sign of American commitment. I think the Jordan base is kind of covered. Now, I'll just close by saying that, of course, the group has a transnational appeal because of its successes, the apparent degree of its commitment, and the religiously, I don't know what the right word is really, a legitimate core of its doctrine. I mean, Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is scriptural, in its inspiration, and there's plenty to point to in Scripture that can support the awful excesses of ISIS. But these awful excesses, in the view of many, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere in the Middle East, are in the service of something good, which is the establishment of a just society in an area of the world, and for Europeans, this includes their own continent, that is European Muslims, which is extremely unjust and does need to be fixed. So its appeal is not all that surprising. Now, I think the appeal of its apocalyptic edge will diminish as it's ground down by military operations carried out by all these countries that and subnational groups that we've just talked about challenging ISIS. But nevertheless, I think they'll pop up in other places because this happens with apocalyptic movements in very unsettled times. And they will pop up in the Sinai, and they'll pop up in Libya, and they may pop up elsewhere in the Maghreb. They may pop up in the Gulf, although I'm quite skeptical about that, at least right now. And each time they do, the U.S. will have to be forced into cooperative counterterrorism arrangements with the very governments whose policies created the conditions that led to the rise of the threat that we're fighting. And we're going to be caught in this crazy feedback loop for years, I expect.
All right. So does Iraq have a future as a unified entity? I mean, we described a lot of pressures operating on the group from Iran, from within. The Shiite militias are still there.
You know, I'm not an Iracologist, but look, my off-the-cuff response was going to be, who cares? I think we can fetishize national cohesion, and Iraq is a good example of that kind of thing. The Kurds, as a practical matter, have their country. Nobody likes to change borders because it's one of these slippery slope things. If you change one, well, then, what about the other one? And then what about that one? So I think, there's a sense that, listen, if we don't screw around with the system too much, we're not going to worry so much, we're not going to have to worry so much about it being challenged down the road. But I think, that concern with respect to the unity of Iraq is probably at this point OBE, overtaken by events. The Kurds, as a practical matter, have their country. The Sunni areas will never be taken back. And they can't be, because look at, if you'll just indulge me for just a second, if you look at what the U.S. and its Iraqi allies and the Kurds, who are allegedly the anvil in this hammer operation against the Sunnis in the western and northern provinces. If you look at what they can do, they can get in there and they can kill Sunnis, and they will, once they really get their act together. The Shiite militias are already doing it. The United States is certainly very adept at it. We've been doing it pretty consistently since 2003, with a little break recently. So, we can do that. We can kill Sunnis. But the thing is to pacify that area, to create a situation that Admiral Fallon was describing, I think quite accurately, where the Sunnis would have to feel as though they were part of an Iraqi polity. Not possible, because if you look at what General Petraeus had to do when he implemented the surge, it was really fascinating, because up until then, the policy had been pretty much get in there and kill those guys. And I think we were doing a fairly good job. General Petraeus came in and he said, well, we've got to do things a lot differently if we're going to bring about this state of affairs where there's a greater degree of inclusivity and some chance, therefore, for the cohesion of the Iraqi state going forward. But to do that required a new defense secretary in the United States, a new leadership in Baghdad, a new combatant commander in Iraq, and a very carefully implemented strategy that had to be indoctrinated down to the last corporal in the Army, in the U.S. Army and Marine Corps that were operating in these areas. There's no way, it seems to me, that the Iraqi army and the essentially Shiite Iraqi government can come anywhere near duplicating what the U.S. did in the 2 years that the surge was in operation. And if they can't do it, then we're not going to have a united Iraq down the road. Sorry for taking so long.
No. So, Admiral Fallon, maybe that's a great place to pick up. So whether the Iraqi army, you started off by saying that we spent a long time trying to build these guys up, and then they kind of melted like ice in the desert when the fighting started to get really intense last summer. So, how do you think about this as an institution and as an effective fighting force?
If I could kind of piggyback on a couple things Steve said here. That critical time from 2006, 2008 was when I was over there. Dave Petraeus was my ground commander in Iraq. It was more complex than Steve mentioned, I can guarantee you that. And maybe to just kind of set the scene, I don't have any Pollyannish view that to Suzanne's point, that any individual is going to rise up and suddenly they're all going to lay down their weapons and peacefully live together. Just not likely to happen. But there are some things that historically have occurred that tell me that in the right conditions, there may be a way forward. At any rate, we could speculate all night on what might or might not happen. But let me just share a couple of anecdotes with you from my experience. One is the difficulty of dealing in an environment that has so much distrust and hate as an undercurrent. Really is a challenge, and this entire region is just riven with things from very large issues like the Sunni-Shia split and in my view, the persecution complex that really engulfs the Iranians and the Shia Iraqis. And the flip side of that is the fact that Iran has been ascendant in the last 20 or so years, after the 30 years since the revolution, and the fact that they've aligned with Shia in Iraq sends shivers through the largely Sunni Gulf region. Interesting, isn't it? So if you look at numbers alone, the Shia are 20% maybe of the total, and the Sunni vast outnumber them. Look at resources, again, there's a total imbalance, but revenge is a pretty good motivator, and there's a lot of fear over there on all sides. So put this back in Iraq. So Maliki takes over as the leader, and he's got a majority of the country that are Shia, and they have been persecuted by Saddam and his thugs for a number of decades. And they are motivated by a couple things. They're motivated by revenge. They're motivated, and by the way, this is the Islamic world after all, and a lot of the literal interpretations of the Quran are carried out pretty regularly. So revenge is a factor. Fear about the Baathists are coming back. I heard that countless times. They're coming around and behind every palm tree. They're going to come back and get us. And then the Iranians, who had a very complex and vested interest. Again, Suzanne touched on a lot of these things. These guys have their own agenda. And I couldn't agree more that there's no chance we're going to cooperate with Soleimani and his thugs, because they were the absolute worst offenders, in my view, of perpetrating some pretty heinous crimes against our soldiers and Marines over there. I don't want anything to do with them, but I know that's pretty well held in Washington. And why? Because these guys have, around the world, the Quds Force that he represents, that he leads, have been the perpetrators of murders and assassinations throughout the world. That's their job, because they're acting as the strong right arm of this revolutionary messianic regime in Tehran. Back to Iraq. Often, given this background, Maliki would go through fits of anguish. It was almost a nightly affair where he'd come up, somebody would whisper in his ear about some way to fix things in Iraq. While our forces were trying to force stability into particularly the Baghdad area, he was virtually nightly would come up with, it always happened at night it seemed, but he would come up with an idea about why don't we do this? And usually that was something to get back at the Sunnis yet again, or push the Kurds somewhere. And General Petraeus, Dave, and Ryan Crocker, ambassador, spent a lot of sleepless nights trying to talk him down off the peg on these things. But while we were there, he was generally under control. If worse came to worse, we did have a pretty strong right arm. But when we left and abandoned the place, it was completely turned over to the Iraqis, and all the worst fears and nightmares came true, because there was nobody there to balance that. At any rate, that's difficult to deal with. And the current leader is saying some better things. They've made a few moves in the direction that will be more inclusive. It remains to be seen. There are a lot of structural issues, as Suzanne said. But let me give you another anecdote. On one of my trips over there, I, on every occasion, would go out into the country, into the cities, into the towns, because I wanted to see our people up close, our soldiers and Marines and military forces, and what they were doing and how they were engaging with the people. And so I had a chance to rub elbows with a lot of Iraqis during those, and I'll share one with you. There was one particularly bad day when the al-Qaeda thugs had perpetrated a very, very vicious bombing attack in central Baghdad, killed a lot of people, destroyed a neighborhood that was held in high esteem. It was a historical area of the booksellers, if any of you are familiar with the Hammurabi section of town. And a really, really nasty explosion. It was awful. So I was in there the next day and just surveying the damage and kind of shaking my head. And as I walked down the street, I noticed a large group of Iraqi men in a chai shop, a tea shop, a coffee shop in our culture. And I looked and I said, you know, I think I need to drop in here. And to the chagrin of my security force, which went pretty nuts, I walked into the tea shop and I took off my helmet and my body armor, and they immediately invited me to come and sit down. So I sat in a group of maybe 50 Iraqis, and to speed up to the bottom line, they asked me, they didn't know who I was. They realized I must be somebody, you know, of a certain age or something, but they said, please continue to give us help. Get rid of the politicians. And by the way, you need to know, Mr. General, that we've been around here for a long time. And then he proceeded to go and identify certain people. So he's a Sunni, he's a Shia, he does this, he does this, he does this. And he said, we happen to have known each other for many years, and we get along. And we can get along again. And this culture's been around for many, many hundreds of years. And the demographics of, in fact, before the sectarian violence really got nasty, was that the area of Baghdad was very, very heterogeneous in various groups. They lived all over the city. But when things really got ugly, and the perpetrators of most of that ugliness were, in fact, the Shia militias, who really went after this with a vengeance. So you had on one side al-Qaeda, ISIS, and another name. The other side, the Shia militias, just going after each other. And the victims, of course, were the people in the middle. So this is, my sense, my takeaway from that was, these are people that are just like us in many respects. They live in a culture that is just intolerable from our experience. It's very violent. This is one of the most vicious people I've ever met in the way they get into things. And however, they're people who want to have a future. And they've done it before. And given the right circumstances, they might be able to do it again. Best we're going to be able to do is to try to push ISIS, the Western threat, out of there. And they're going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with the Iranians. Frankly, the Shia government is going to have to. As I saw, they would resist. I guess let me share one other little thing. And this is dangerous because this entire region is so ripped apart with sectarian and religious and ethnic kind of shifts and cracks and fissures. But in the Iran-Iraq war, very awful. But if you look at the casualties in that war, from the Iranian side, you'll find that most of the casualties were actually Arabs. That's not who rules Tehran. The guys in Baghdad know this. They understand that these are Persians from the earlier era that called the shots. And their relative respect or lack of for the Arabs, be they Shia or not, is very well known to these people. So it's not pretty, but there is an opportunity, if we can help, I think, to push some of the worst of the terrorists off the side and maybe give these folks a chance. They're going to have to step up, as I said at the start. They're going to have to actually do things for one another, or the whole thing will just continue to spiral.
I have two more quick questions, which I'll direct to Liz and to Suzanne, and then open it up. Liz, Admiral Fallon talked about this sort of deep substrate of distrust that runs throughout the region, and that's clearly no less true between the U.S. and Iran. So maybe just sketch quickly what in the most optimistic of worlds does a deal with Iran, or at least some kind of framework that will likely be announced in the next couple of weeks, look like? And then, Suzanne, I would love for you to just spin a little bit more on a comment that you made, which I think is directly relevant to both Steve and Admiral Allen's points, which is that the strategy behind the nuclear negotiations thus far has been to divorce the nuclear issue from all of the other questions about Iranian power projection throughout the region. And so if Liz is going to be the optimist for the next 5 minutes, can you just talk to me about how realistic a prospect you think that is, given the kind of ultimate buy-in that will need to be generated for any kind of nuclear deal, both from Israel and from the America's allies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular?
Okay, so I think there is a possibility that we will see the framework or the principles for a deal between the P5+1 and Iran within the next few weeks, but we won't know, to your point, we won't know what all the details will be. I think at best we will have some general principles. There may not be a piece of paper. If there is, they may not share that with anyone else besides the negotiating partners. But I will speculate, if I will, if you'll indulge me here, on what an optimistic deal scenario could look like. And this is based on the way that the methodology, if you will, for the interim deal or the joint plan of action, I think a final deal would build on that kind of methodology and also borrow from the experience of sanctions relief that has occurred in past examples, Libya, Myanmar, Burma, which aren't excellent counterparts here, but they offer some examples of what relief could look like. So a deal, I think, from the nuclear side, it would involve destruction of centrifuges, obviously no second generation or next generation centrifuges. It would involve the removal of stockpiles of enriched material. It would involve intensive oversight by the IAEA, and it would, the administration has said, double-digit timeline, whether that's 10, barely double-digit, or a lot longer, is something we don't know. I think it's closer to, it's somewhere between 10 and 20. It possibly, I'm going to go with closer to 10 than 20 in a final pragmatic best-case deal scenario. On the sanction side, what I think this looks like is the removal, it's supposed to involve the removal of, quote, nuclear-related sanctions. No one knows what that means. It's intentionally vague, and it was intentionally made vague by the negotiating partners, but what it will involve is the greater ability for Iran to sell its oil, and that means everything that goes along with that. So transacting the actual bank transaction, the use of more feasible use of the tanker, insurance and underwriting, the ability to repatriate the money, all of the pieces that go along with actually selling it that have individually been sanctioned to make it very difficult for Iran to do this over the last several years. So access to its reserve and a greater ability to move money internationally, which involves removal of the SWIFT sanctions. I think that in a best-case scenario, Iran could see substantial relief from sanctions by about the close of 2015, that is to say maybe about 6 months after a deal is announced by the end of June. Again, this is totally optimistic, but relief will, so optimistic as to be, I think, unrealizable, but I'll let Suzanne tackle that one. Anyway, if there's an agreement, final agreement with details by the end of June, what Iran will get in sanctions relief and will be closely followed by its own steps to move forward with its part of the deal. They will be tied to verification, and they will move in step together. So I think the first tranche of relief could be about 6 months in, and each additional tranche of relief will be tied to Iran's own work to moving forward with its own concessions as part of a deal. I think it is possible, if Iran is is truly motivated and moving very aggressively, that there could be quite a lot of economic relief, even back to the levels of 2012, that sort of level of sanctions on Iran, which means a much greater ability to sell oil and move money in the international system within several years' time. And then the tail end of the deal is verification, and sanctions could be reimposed if there's failure on Iran's part to comply with its own measures and verifications. And on the diplomatic side, I don't think there's a true normalization, full normalization of diplomatic ties immediately or necessarily in the medium term or maybe even at the end of this. But there will be communications that exist. They already do exist. I think they will grow a bit broader. That's certainly a good thing. And the degree to which there will be economic integration between, for example, Iran and the United States will be, I expect, extraordinarily minimal for the entire life of this deal. Maybe will begin to expand towards the end of it, though Iran's economic dealings with other countries in the region and East Asia and globally will, of course, expand earlier on, which is what accounts for its economic relief earlier on in the deal.
Very optimistic. Suzanne.
I don't know if I'm the pessimist here, but let me talk a little bit about this disconnect between the nuclear file and our long other list of concerns with respect to Iranian foreign and domestic policy. You know, it's a perfectly reasonable disconnect. We have a process that was established for nuclear negotiations. It wasn't actually established by Washington. It was established by 3 European countries that were trying to fend off the appetites of the then Bush administration in the aftermath of the revelations of the extent of Iran's nuclear activities back in late 2002. Those negotiations morphed over time, and in 2006 became formally joined by the United States, as well as the other permanent 5 other members of the UN Security Council, as well as the EU itself. And that was a track that, you know, frankly has had its ups and downs. It's, you know, we've seen the most success since the 2013 election of Hassan Rouhani as Iran's president. But there was never any sort of contemplation of incorporating other issues for the obvious reason that A, they hadn't really gotten very far on the nuclear issue, and B, there wasn't really a sort of confluence of agreement on those other concerns among even our European partners. So you know, there's a negotiating track that exists for the nuclear issue. I think we have to ride that as far as we possibly can in terms of making progress. The idea of trying to attach other issues to this deal or to these negotiations like a Christmas tree is a little bit unrealistic because we just don't have any support from the other members of this coalition. And take note, this coalition is unique. We have never found this level of support among the permanent 5 on any other major world crisis, I might hazard a guess, but certainly not on Iran. I mean, if you look back at the past 3.5 decades of U.S. policy toward Iran, we struggled even in the worst of times after the seizure of the U.S. embassy to persuade even our closest allies in Europe and Japan to sign on to economic pressure against the Iranians over the seizure and the holding of the hostages for 15 months. So the idea that we've been able to amass this incredible coalition that really goes well beyond the P5+1 to apply pressure to Iran is unique, ahistorical, and probably temporary in nature. It will at some point, I think, begin to burn out, and we may actually see that depending on how the Congress acts in the aftermath of what happens over the course of the next few weeks. Let me just say, though, that some of what you're seeing and hearing in terms of the opposition to the nuclear deal from the Gulf and the sort of sense that they feel like their interests have been traded away isn't so much about the specifics of the deal. There are genuine concerns about some of the terms that have come out in the press that may be on offer, frankly, due to some fairly effective negotiating tactics on the part of the Iranians and the determination, I think, of the Obama administration to get a deal, any deal, because a deal is always better than all the alternatives alternatives, and we can talk about why if we ever have time to do so. But what has happened is this sort of conspiracy theory, and I think you heard a couple of the other panelists talk about it in broad terms, that there's a rapprochement underway, that the Obama administration has a secret strategy of trying to create a détente with Iran to replace all its standing allies in the region and to revive this sort of partnership that existed before the revolution. As I think you can probably gather from my comments and from the rest of the panel's comments, it's completely fabulous. I mean, there's absolutely no basis to this conspiracy theory, but I will tell you that it is fairly widespread and deeply held, not just in the Gulf, not just among some Israelis, but certainly among many in Washington, Democrats and Republicans. There is this perception that there is a détente underway, that this is the ultimate aim of Obama's efforts to negotiate with Iran. Iran's interest is in getting out of the penalty box, and that's, of course, the difficulty that we face over the course of the next few months, and why, again, we're seeing this opposition to a deal. As I said, we will never see this sort of current levels of economic pressure amassed against Iran. It will never be replicated under almost any kind of circumstances, absent a really wild provocation by the Iranians. And so the fear of so many of our partners and allies is that once we begin to let that pressure up, we will never be able to address the range of other issues and concerns with respect to Iran, particularly as they involve terrorism in the region.
Great. So, yeah. How did ISIS get established, and if we look back, what would we or what could we have done differently that would have prevented the group from becoming so strong?
I'll jump off the cliff here first. I think you've heard from the majority of the panel that there are a lot of factors at play here, and I think that's the instigation of ISIS is pretty indicative of that reality. So you have a number of folks who it looks like collaborated while we had them in prison in Iraq, and that is something that's also been widely discussed, and there's lots of incorrect information out there on that piece too, but that's subject for another day. But there were people who got together and started talking about when we get out of here, we'll go do something. They found lots of helpers in the disaffected, and certainly in the western part of Iraq and the mostly Sunni area. As Maliki played his cards pretty poorly, that just added to the feeling of they don't care about us, and the only way we're going to get square again is to go get the sword and let's go after them. And so it kind of picked up momentum. Syria, wide open, lawless territory, most of the fighting going on in the west, and so they have this vast area of open spaces with opportunity to recruit zealots and so forth. And I think in recent times, this stuff kind of appeals to a certain segment of the population. People shake their heads and they say, well, look at this guy that they've identified as the knife wielder in some of these videos. What's the background? How did he come from over here to over here? Who knows? But the fact is, there are people out there that are susceptible to this siren song. And our experience, from my view, in Iraq is, I think, instructive here. Al-Qaeda got a lot of recruits from the outside, and they got them because they appeared to be on a roll. They were, jihadists that were inflicting great pain on the infidel Americans and the New Day Crusaders, and on and on and on. What I found was the recruiting lines were were pretty full until the reality of martyrdom got through to these guys. These were one-way tickets. So most of them came actually out of Syria into Iraq. And by mid-2007, nobody was going home. It had a rather chilling effect. It wasn't that we had now put up a big barrier or something out in the desert and it's not going to happen. But this was a one-way ticket. And their momentum ran out of steam, and they were getting whipped and losing, and so they could not pull in recruits. I think one of the fundamental flaws that, to get to Steve's comment here about ISIS, or they're unlikely to be a long-term challenge, is the very fact that they're recruiting all these outsiders, and that doesn't sit too well in most of these countries. And so they're sowing the seeds of their own demise. I think we saw that exact same thing in Iraq with the outsiders, and you can see some of this that played out in Afghanistan as well. So a lot of little bits and pieces, they came together. They found common cause in violence. They have people who give them money. There are folks, distorted as we may think, who think this is a wonderful idea for, you name the particular one of the 50 strains of zealotry that run through here, and they give them money, and they support them with other means. So I think they can be dealt with, frankly. The problems that I identified early on about the necessary inclusiveness that has to go on with governments is fundamental. In terms of military, these guys are a pickup gang of bad actors. They're ruthless. And frankly, we're going to have to do something with the leadership to make them go away. And then I suspect you'll see some of the followers will probably beat feet. But there is no single galvanizing, this is the message, and they all picked it up. It's different stories.
Sir.
The longest wars in American history have been those where there are no reliable allies, especially on the spot. Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq, wherever else we went. The one exception was Bosnia and Kosovo. The native peoples hated each other with all of the religious apocalyptic hatred that you thought. And the way that the war was eventually ended was for the superpowers with the heavy armory to begin to withdraw. Now, if the panel seems to be agreed that there's no good allies in this place, that you can't rely on people, look at our experiences in Iraq, wherever else, even if Iran should become a more reliable character in Egypt, let alone Saudi Arabia. We're in for long wars, and the long wars become very painful and divisive. And as the Admiral said, we're not going to win this with superior armament, a lot of money, let alone boots on the ground. Why not go for something entirely different? As in the Dayton Agreements, which is a form, however complex, of really difficult diplomacy and relying on UN peacekeeping, which hasn't been a very good, very successful way of doing things, but of being able to move out rather than to move in and answer the Admiral's question. Even if we were to degrade and reduce ISIS and ISL, how about that we anticipate that in the aftermath of a war there is graver danger? So let's find another way of doing it, instead of, as the mood in Congress seems to be, let's intensify the effort rather than to move away from it.
Thank you, sir. Dating in the Middle East. Any takers? Okay. All the way, yeah, right here in the middle. And then I think we have one more. Go ahead, yeah.
Hi, my name is Alexander Russell, and I had a question for Mr. Simon. You mentioned hiving off some of the parts of ISIS. Do you have any idea how that policy would play out? How you would do that?
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one more. Excuse me. Yeah, sure, in the middle. Sure. So just to recap, what has been the economic effects in Iran of the sanctions and the 50% decline in the price of oil? Liz, do you want to?
Sure. So Iran, by comparison to some of the other countries in the Gulf, is relatively more integrated diversified economically. They're not as reliant on oil receipts as some of their other neighbors. Also under President Rouhani, they've been making aggressive steps to try and actually, we should take this relatively, but they've been making steps to roll back subsidies, and there's been a massive government-led investment campaign to try and spur growth. And GDP has moved positive in 2014 and is expected to in 2015. Now, oil, the 50% decrease in oil prices will certainly eat into that, and primarily because the government has revised its spending, its budget calculations, anticipating a lower price of oil. And they actually don't, ironically or paradoxically, they've been insulated to some degree from the decrease in the price of oil because most of their revenues are locked up, inaccessible to them abroad, and they get, because of sanctions, an allowance of about $700 million a month. So regardless of the price of oil, which is, of course, a fraction of what they need and are planning around, but because they have adjusted spending based on the lower price of oil, they are feeling this lower oil price environment just like every other major producer. However, I would say that I don't think the decision-making calculus has been affected by the lower price of oil. I think there's a very clear commitment to the political principles by the leadership in Iran to move forward with these negotiations, but the lower price of oil, I don't think, has encouraged them to move faster or make greater concessions than they otherwise would have. There's a culture of resistance economy and a high tolerance to live in under difficult economic circumstances, and they are certainly not now what they were during the Iran-Iraq War. So with a historical memory of more difficult times and the prospect for potential economic relief in the future because of sanctions and because of improved domestic economic management, there will be a continuation, I think, in this steady state path, regardless of the drop in oil prices, which, as I said, I don't think is changing the overall strategic decision-making calculus.
Suzanne, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think just real quickly, you know, the sanctions had a devastating effect on the average Iranian. I haven't been able to go in about a decade. If anyone wants to secure me a visa, I'd be very happy to return. But I think everything that we see was that never before have sanctions played out so personally on the average Iranian's pocketbook. The currency lost almost half its value within a matter of weeks when the central bank sanctions were just announced, even before they were fully imposed. That kind of pressure had all kinds of implications for the economy. This is a fairly competent government. They know how to run the economy, and they have, as Liz said, a fairly diverse economic base outside of oil, although very much related to oil. So they've been able to cope, but don't kid yourself. It is this pressure that has contributed to the decision to come to the table. It's the pressure that contributed to the election of Hassan Rouhani. It was discussed openly throughout the campaign that led to his victory. And the continuation and the exacerbation of the pressure that we're seeing as a result of the drop in oil prices is going to play into leadership decision-making, just as it did, not immediately, during the Iran-Iraq War, when Iran experienced also a catastrophic change in its revenue base as a result of a drop in oil prices that was largely driven by Saudi overproduction then as it is now. At the time, in '86, as it was happening, the Iranians were not willing to end the war. But over the course of 2 very difficult years, during which time there were far greater domestic unrest and a much more open debate about the costs of the war and the relative benefits of continuing, the decision was taken to do the unthinkable, to end the war and to accept a ceasefire without victory. And I think that while I don't advocate additional pressure on Iran, I think that we have to recognize that this is a regime that can make cost-benefit decisions, and the changing revenue base is going to influence that.
Great. Well, thank you, and please everyone join me thanking